Thank you so much, everybody, for being here this evening. We are really excited to welcome Dr. Daniel Aldrich, a leading global expert on disaster recovery and community resilience. He is the Dean's Professor of Resilience and Director of the Resilience Studies Program at Northeastern University. He's also an author of 5 books, including Building Resilience and Black Wave, as well as countless peer-reviewed papers and op-eds in the New York Times and CNN. And personally, for Steph and I, in building Altagether, his work has been a major influence in developing our structure and how we approach recovery work, and the power structures that we create for neighborhood captains. And we're looking to even more heavily embody the findings from his research in the second year, as we enter the second year of recovery here. So Dr. Aldrich is going to give us a presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be collecting those, and then we'll go through them in the back half. And I'll also send out a recap and recording afterwards tomorrow, along with some links for further research for anybody who's interested. Also, special thank you to folks who are not part of Altogether for being here. I know we have other community leaders here, and we really appreciate you joining us for this. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Daniel Aldrich.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the invitation. Hopefully you can see my screen right now. And I put up a few different ways to reach me. My wife would say I waste half my day engaging in pointless battles on the internet, so you can join me there, waging battles, especially on the hellscape that is Twitter. Feel free to join me there, have some normal conversations. So I'd like to talk a little bit, before I talk about this stuff, about why I'm here. Like, why do I care deeply about this concept of resilience, concept of disasters? And I'd like to begin with a before and after picture. So this is our home at 6944 Canal Boulevard in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we had 6 very good weeks in our home. And unfortunately, it looked like this. Afterwards, this was, of course, Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, which shut down everything that we knew. Our kids' school never opened that year. Tulane, where I was supposed to work, never opened that year, and gave me a lot of free time because I had no job and no car either, and no house. So a lot of free time to think about what it meant to be resilient, not just to bounce back, to build back something as it was, but to build a community that was ready for the future, ready for future disasters. I noticed a lot of the language out in the world about resilience and disasters often emphasized individual level responses. Do you have a kit? Do you have insurance? Do you have 15 gallons of water ready to go? That's one very common thing I've seen in the literature. The other side of it is that the government's going to get you ready, right? Don't worry about this. We're going to build, as here in this image from my field work in Japan, we're going to build a massive set of walls or technological miracles or some kind of app. We're going to keep you safe from the threat. For those of you who've been through a shock, and I'm sure that's many of you on this call with me right now, I think we all know that the answer to resilience is not at the individual level nor at the government level, but someplace in between, what we call social capital. Social capital are the ties that bring us together, and they're different types, and they matter a lot. There's not some kumbaya monolithic approach to life. We really want to understand what kind of connections do we see in the community. Bonding ties are those between people who are quite similar. So if you're a fast-talking middle-aged white guy, probably many of your friends are fast-talking middle-aged white guys. Bridging ties, in contrast, are heterogeneous. That means they connect you to people who are different than you. So that might be through a school, that might be through a club, it might be through an activity, like Altogether. Bonding and bridging are horizontal ties. Linking social capital is a vertical tie between me and someone in power and authority. And these ties matter for all kinds of reasons. The very first choice made by any survivor of a shock is whether or not to return to a damaged home. We call this the exit and voice choice. Exit means, of course, going someplace else might be a lot easier. If you're a business person or you own a small business, there might be clients there that aren't affected by the shock that you just went through. If you have opportunity costs, right, that are lower someplace else, financial costs of restarting in the same place are quite high. The materials, labor are much higher, more expensive now, even if you have insurance. And of course, there's psychological costs. Every day you're in a place where you lost a loved one or a pet or your business, it's pretty tough psychologically. So for many people after a shock, we see a large out migration from the community. We call that exit. At the same time, though, some people will stick by the community no matter what. We call this using voice. It's often because they have a sense of belonging, a sense of place. Their friends, their family, their connections are there, and they will put in whatever it takes to rebuild in that community. The other thing that social capital gets you is the ability to overcome collective action problems. Many of the challenges that we face post-disaster cannot be solved by one institution or one person by themselves. It requires us working together. Well, post-disaster, most of us are busy trying to find a new job, get our house fixed, get our kids into school, pay the old mortgage if we're still paying the bank for the old house, meaning we have a lot of things going on. I'm not going to show up for a meeting if I don't know why I'm there, if I don't trust someone involved, if I don't think it's going to be useful to me. So any meeting you have then post-disaster, a zoning board meeting, a planning meeting, all of those require overcoming the barriers to collective action. Social capital makes that a lot easier. The third and final theory about why this matters is what we call informal insurance. Most times during a major shock, local providers, daycare, gas stations, food, medical services are shut down for weeks, if not months. We didn't have a daycare or a gas station in my neighborhood in New Orleans for more than half a year after Hurricane Katrina. So you need some place to get those resources from. We call this informal insurance because it doesn't require money to build these ties. It requires an investment of friendship and enmity. So those are the theoretical reasons why this matters. I want to give you some quick examples of ways we've seen social capital playing a role in major shocks and disasters. These images come from quite some time ago, Hurricane Irma, and those red splotches around Miami are the cell phone signals of people who in several days will be in trouble when the hurricane arrives. The blue splotches you see developing on the 6th and the 8th, those are individuals leaving the area. But you notice by the 8th, so 4 days after FEMA and the local mayor and all the disaster managers began telling people to leave, 4 days later, there's still a big red splotch there, meaning people didn't leave. There's still people that are there. What happened? Why do we still have people there? This is the eye test. What we did is we measured bonding, bridging, and linking ties in the community. And it turns out if the only sources of information that you have coming from people that are like us, bonding ties, people tend not to evacuate before a major shock. If the sources of information that are coming are broader and more diverse, then we're seeing more individuals being able to leave that area and going to find someplace a lot safer. That's even before the disaster arrives. I've got a lot of data also from our lab from major quick onset disasters. This is the 2011 triple disaster in Japan, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdowns, where some 20,000 people lost their lives. The good news for those of us social scientists watching this was that most communities had no casualties. That's the big black bar there near the origin of zero. The bad news, though, is that some communities lost as many as 1 in 10 people. What we saw was that was not well correlated with the height, that is the power of the tsunami. There wasn't a clear pattern between how tall it was and mortality rates. So I got to exercise my superpower, which my wife would say is being annoying. So for a 2-year Fulbright in Japan, I asked questions of survivors, of the families of the deceased, local NGOs, mayors, and governors to understand what factors pushed communities towards survival or away from it. It turns out of all the different things that we tested, the best predictor of surviving that tsunami came from the strength or weakness of bonding ties. Where you knew your neighbors, where they could work together collectively to help people out, those communities had much higher survival rates. Where trust was lower, engagement was lower, people didn't know each other as well, survival rates were much lower. We've also measured recovery after disasters, 2 years and 3 years later, to see what's going on in these communities. How are they rebuilding? And you see some of them 2 years later have built back to 50%, 60%, some built back to 100%. There's clear differences. Not every community builds back in similar patterns. And we have images of some of the communities we studied. This is Ishinomaki, 1 month and 1 year afterwards. This is Tagajo, 1 month, 1 year, and 2 years. Now, why the white van is still there, I've got some theories about insurance fraud, but I can't explain them. But what I noticed in one of my visits was that one of the communities there I'm calling Coastal City had built a massive bridge. Actually, it's not a bridge, it's a conveyor belt. That conveyor belt was crushing up the mountains nearby on the left side of the image and shipping them a mile downstream to the old downtown and gradually lifting it up. They were literally raising their future against future shocks. This conveyor belt was over $220 million US, and the community was only 16,000 people. So I asked, again, my annoying superpower, how is it possible you could afford this? Turns out here, linking ties, a vertical connection between the local mayor and someone in power strongly drove recovery. Where horizontal ties mattered so much initially, in the long-term recovery processes, we need people with levers of power to push resources toward the area. Another area of recovery is mental health. We'd love the idea that after a shock, mental health would be fine. That's typically not the case. So that'd be the top layer here. The bottom two rows are more common. The middle row shows that after a major shock, you lose a loved one, lose your house, you lose your job. You see a dip overall in performance, hard to focus, hard to get things done. And occasionally you do see major PTSD kind of things where hard to hold down a job, hard to hold down a relationship as well. So we had the honor of studying several hundred survivors of the Fukushima evacuation. 140,000 people evacuated from nuclear meltdowns. Some had 2 hours to take a single bag of stuff and have not been back since. So we wondered what would happen here in terms of mental health. What are the kind of things that would drive people back to where they were, or at least close to where they were? We initially thought that income and physical health would be best predictors for mental health. Neither actually really predicted anything. The middle class, the poor, the wealthy, all of them had similar levels of mental shock. And being in good physical condition, eating tofu every day, running a marathon didn't make a difference. So the one thing that did, strong social connections. Individuals who had neighbors that they knew, connections they had, those individuals had far fewer levels of mental distress. I don't have time tonight, but I can tell you as well, if you're wondering, well, Daniel, that's nice about these, quick natural hazards. How about a thing like a pandemic? How about that? Same kind of patterns there. During pandemics, strong social ties kept out the virus from communities longer. There are lower positivity rates, and then mortality rates also were lower. I want to jump now to some solutions and then to one more topic. If social capital, if these ties are critical, what can communities do to build them, right? If this is a way of building resilience, what are we doing? So hopefully some of you recognize the person in the red sweater. I hope you do. Anyone in the recognize that person? Fred Rogers. When I was a kid, he asked me every morning to be a good neighbor. And if I asked you on this call, I'm sure many of you can name the first and last names of 10 of your neighbors, which is probably why you're on the call right now. Unfortunately, the average person in San Francisco, in New York, Mexico City, Tokyo can't. Fewer than 1 in 8 of us are able to name our neighbors' first and last names. That's critical, as you probably discovered from experience, because during shocks and disasters, the zero responders, people who are there on the ground first, those individuals tend not to be individuals those that we don't know, for example, a uniformed police officer or whatever, those tend to be people that live right nearby. So the first thing we do as a lab is try to build neighbor-to-neighbor connections. The next image from neighbor is neighborhood. That's Indiana. We used to live. I lived there briefly after Hurricane Katrina. And that's a block party. So you block off the street, bring out the barbecue, get out some frisbees or whatever you do. Here, San Francisco, for example, will give each community $5,000 every year to hold a block party. That block party is their way of building resilience against a future shock. They can't retrofit every building against the seismic earthquake that's coming, but they can build up these social ties in the community. So San Francisco's approach to building resilience is not about physical infrastructure, it's about building these connections. The next image there in the top row is social infrastructure, the spaces and places where we build connection. I'll talk about that in a second. The bottom left hand is like right now, someone's talking in a meeting, blah, 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 and you're all checking your email. This is democracy though, right? Democracy is meetings, zoning meetings, school board meetings, planning meetings. Our lab helps think of ways to get those to be more engaging so people show up. Faith-based community, FBOs there in the middle. And finally, community currency. We know that we want more people to volunteer, to leave their homes, put their screens down for a minute. So we want to create a way to do it. So we incentivize it. We offer Toronto dollars or Berkeley dollars or Ithaca dollars, whatever, get them out of their house. That currency cannot be spent at McDonald's or Costco. It only circulates at local stores. So you get people more volunteering, more local currency traveling around. I'm going to go quickly to a second topic that's related to this, and then I'll stop talking. I mentioned this concept of social infrastructure, the spaces and places where we build connections. I want to tell you one more story and a few observations that we've made. This is part of Japan, Tohoku, the northeastern quarter there. That's the black box around the corner. And there are two cities side by side, Taro and Sumohama. Both of those communities have faced major tsunami, huge ocean waves every 100 years or so for the last 1,000 years. So they've had a lot of lived experience. They have a lot of institutionalized memory as well. So the question is, how do they handle that? What do they do to build resilience to the future? Taro has built the Great Wall of Japan, this massive 2.5-story concrete castle around the entire community. You see that on the left there, built in the 1960s and 70s. It bankrupted the community, it was so expensive. Smohama, in contrast, built no physical infrastructure, no apps, no physical walls, just drills, evacuation drills. And what you see right there is even the elderly, every elderly person has their own wheelbarrow in case they're too immobile to be moving by themselves. Their neighbors get them in there and push them up the hill. And the question I'm going to ask you is to think about is, where would you rather live in a community facing disaster? The one surrounded by castle walls or the one where all the neighbors work regularly to build those ties and evacuate? We've been thinking about this question of social infrastructure for quite some time. Where are we building ties and connections in our neighborhoods? We've broken them into four categories: what we call parks or open spaces, community spaces, places of worship, and social businesses, cafes, rock climbing gyms, karaoke bars, and so forth. And those four categories matter a lot. Because if you remember the three categories of social capital, bonding, bridging, and linking, bonding ties are people like us. That's family. You don't need much work to work on those. Bridging ties, though, are harder to build, especially in a polarized society. We have found these are the spaces left in society where people are building these ties. At bars, at parks, at libraries, after school programs, these are the places where we're knitting together the social fabric of our society. So what we tried to do with several experiments, one of the experiments we did was what happens in the community where there is no social infrastructure. There's no parks, there's no libraries, no places to interact. We built one. You're looking at it. It's called Ibasho in Japanese, which means roughly my place. And the yellow vest wearing people are our board of directors there. And we try to see after 2 years what consequences came out from that, from building a new place to connect. Social networks got broader, people made more friends, the sense of belonging got deeper, and the sense of efficacy also increased, thanks to the participation in this process over time. Okay, then if social infrastructure can do that, what can it do during disasters? What differences can it make? So we measured 700 neighborhoods and found those areas with higher density had lower mortality. Places that had more libraries, parks, places to play per person, those areas had built enough social capital to make lives safer during shocks. And if you think, well, Daniel, that's about Japan. Come on, give me a break. We actually have data as well from North America. We were asked by some communities in Louisiana, you see them in the purple there, to help study what the consequences were for post-disaster spending. What happens after disaster when you have a big pot of money and you can do whatever you want with it, right? You could build an airport, a 6-lane highway, you could build a new city hall. What we found was investments in social infrastructure that was from the community brought more people back and they brought more income back. Investments that were top down, huge highway projects, new building, berms, fire breaks, water protection, all that stuff, top down things that were expensive, those tended to suppress return and they also suppressed income. So what do we care? Well, right now we can build pretty good maps of social capital of North America, but we cannot do so for social infrastructure for North America. So here in Boston, we had to literally send our undergraduates with phones and GPS trackers to go out, and they walked around 100 miles. There's a lot of distance they covered to map over 1,200 spaces. What we found was that certain neighborhoods in Boston had a lot of these places, parks, social businesses, and so forth. Others had basically none. And we saw a real difference between those at the top and those at the bottom, suggesting that many North American communities probably have uneven access to these spaces. We also found very uneven investments in them, meaning that most money tended to go to large-scale projects, new technologically based things, and those big gray things rather than bottom-up projects from the community. This is my last slide, I promise. So I try to argue today that we're building up connections and we're building up resilience, not because of individual choices and not because of governmental ones. We're building resilience to shocks and disasters through our social ties. Those often come from the places and spaces where we meet people. That is to say, the mundane activities of meeting at a library, meeting an after-school program, meeting at a YMCA, those are very powerful ways to build connections to future disasters. I'll stop talking there and happy to have a conversation.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, Professor. So I'll kick it off with a few questions, and then anybody else who wants to chime in, either in the chat or if you'd like to raise your hand and come off mute. We've only got 27 folks here, so I think we can manage that. I'll start with sort of a broad question, which is there's a lot of talk about like the rate of recovery or the speed of recovery. So I first just wanted to ask you how should we think about measuring recovery? Is it speed, ability to recover? How do you think about it?
I mean, there's easy ways to measure recovery and there's accurate ways to measure recovery. So what tends to happen, I have found, is that governments, especially local governments, tend to use the easiest metrics available, which are things like how many people have come back there. So they might take a census block study, for example, or an American Community Survey or other or ESRI ESRI data that they had from before, and say, okay, we see a year has passed, 2 years have passed, 5 years have passed. Here's the number of individuals back in community X or neighborhood Y. That's one way of measuring things. It's not a bad measurement. It does tell you, for example, has there been broad out migration, the exit and voice question we talked about? Have people repopulated it? What will the tax base look like? It's not a bad approach. We try to use more, let's call them more nuanced measures. We ask questions like, do you feel you're involved in the recovery? To what degree do you feel the recovery is building a community where you'll be in 5 years? To what degree do you feel that you have a voice in the recovery? So we ask a lot of questions about efficacy and satisfaction. Those, of course, are not so happy for local governments in many cases, because, of course, in many recovery processes, many local citizens tell us they don't feel that they're being listened to or being involved to participate in the process. So those are questions that we would ask. We would also want to know, and this is just me talking out loud here, the impact on the social community itself. To what degree did this shock, a fire, a flood, a tsunami, whatever, change the social networks in the community? And there are different ways to measure that as well. Again, typically local governments can't do that. So those are things I would measure. The easiest is population recovery. Next level down would be things like measuring satisfaction, and then the most complicated would be measuring the degree to which social networks have reformed. 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years after the shock.
I've got another sort of table setting question for you, which is I'm curious about like placing your research in the sort of broader disaster resilience recovery field, and I'm wondering like you have a lot of pr provocative kind of ideas, and I'm wondering are there folks that strongly disagree with your findings? Is there like controversy around this, or is this model kind of accepted in the field now?
That is a great and sensitive question. So the short answer would be, as my son would say, I definitely have my ops. Well, I think it means opponents, if I understand modern slang, but that's not really how I speak normally. Some people would say, hey, Daniel, it's nice to talk about this, but look, let's be honest. What really matters in terms of recovery are economics. What really matters are insurance coverage in the community. What really matters are house rebuilding rates. Or they might say there are a lot of other factors out there as well. There's education, right? There's gender, there's demographics, there's connectivity. So, a lot of people, I think, would, not a lot of people, there are definitely many other scholars who disagree with this approach.
Hmm.
Most people that I talk to that have been through a disaster, like myself and maybe everyone on this call, say, of course that it matters. Pardon my French. Of course it freaking matters because it's really obvious, right, during a shock that we're not just talking about rebuilding a physical place like an apartment. I want to feel like a human being again, like my network's established again. So for many people that you talk with about a disaster, it's clear to them as a survivor, yes, of course, these things matter. Having a feeling of being connected matters. Feeling that my voice matters is critical to me. So oftentimes those scholars would say, well, Daniel, you've taken, I think at this point 114 papers. Nice, but there are probably other things you've missed. So I recognize that. I'm not ever claiming that this is the only way to do things. But from my own experience, plus the research that we were doing, I'm staking my personal reputation on the argument that we do not take seriously enough the idea that these connections not only are they important to survivors, but they in fact guide the recovery process. As I said, they guide survival during the shock. They guide the mental health processes afterwards. Those vertical ties guide who gets aid and who gets assistance. I didn't bring in data, but I've got data from India, for example. I was after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. I was in India for a while doing research there. I can show you amazing data on the degree to which communities recovered. Again, a solid function of their connections to the central government. But the short answer would be, yes, there are those who disagree, but they tend to be other scholars who are a little more abstract thinking oftentimes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for engaging with that sensitive question. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll kick it to Mike, who I see has his hand up. What are some signs that a place is well positioned to pull off a faster, more equitable, long-lasting recovery? And what are some signs we can look for that we're doing well at this as a community?
Yeah. I mean, there's sort of subtle things and there's really obvious things. I'll give you some of the obvious things that I saw in New Orleans. If the same four people show up at the meeting, and it's only those four people, right? So the local government, local planner, the architect, the urban designers show up and say, "Hey, everybody, let's get together. We're going to talk about the community." And those same four people show up to every meeting, which happened a lot. Or there's only a few meetings that are being planned. Let's say they're all on a whatever Monday afternoon at 6 o'clock when parents can't come and people who are busy can't come. Those are probably signs from New Orleans that I've seen and around the world that we're not really getting the engagement that we really need to see. Um, there are more subtle signs that you could use. Again, the questions that I would be asking at the meeting would be, so and so, nice to meet you. I'm Daniel. I'm a weird social scientist from out of town. Can I ask you a few questions? One of them is, do you feel like at this meeting you're being talked to or talked with? Do you feel like your visions for the future are being incorporated here? Is there a chance for you to have your voice made? What's slowing down the recovery for you? If no one's asking those questions, that is to say, asking residents what they're thinking, and everything is about some top-down meeting, I would say that's not a great sign. If it's the same people that are going there, it's not a great sign. And the other thing I would also push is, what does it look like in the room? I'm just making this up, but let's say, for example, you knew that someone had a mention, someone else owned, a local real estate development company, and you have a bunch of local people in normal jobs. If it's only one kind of person in the room in those meetings, this happened in New Orleans, certain people could show up for the meetings and have their voices heard, others didn't. So the vision the government got then was a very skewed one from the actually community wanted on the process.
Hmm.
So again, I think there's a lot of things you've been looking at as a social scientist who studies disaster. Some of those are probably obvious to all of you. Again, who's been at meetings? How diverse are they? How engaged are they? How engaging are they? But the other question also is who's actually coming back, right? So you can capture this, right? If you had a neighbor who had to sell their property to a developer, or if you had a neighbor who can't afford the now higher cost of labor and construction materials and they're waiting, or if you got a neighbor who's suing their insurance company. So you all have this data. I mean, that's not information I have. And people in this call right now have probably very good information. If we ask all of you to write, okay, like talk about your 5 houses or 5 apartments nearest to you, what's going on with them, we could probably build a pretty good image, at least to parts of the community, and to see what's going on. So those are things that I would want to do if I were involved in the process.
Okay, thank you. Mike, did you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, first, again, I just wanted to reiterate thank you so much for the time that you're giving us here and the expertise. We really appreciate it. So I'll try to paint the picture here. My perspective of Altadena, and I think a lot of people on this call, is we do have a lot of social capital here. There's really strong ties between neighbors in a lot of these areas of Altadena. As some anecdotal evidence, the moment the fire broke out, 6 different neighbors knocked on our door to let us know. Within 2 weeks after the fire, we were on a neighborhood chat with over 70 people. Obviously, that's just one example, but the reason why I'm giving this table setting is my perspective, and I think a lot of people on this call would agree, that recovery has been overwhelming at times because there's so much help, because there's been so much self-organization immediately after the fire, because there is so much social capital, that it even though it is organized, it can feel overwhelming and disorganized. And I was curious if you've had any experience with communities that were so ready to help and wanted to help that maybe if you have any insight on how long it takes for recovery to start to feel steady, and that there's a little bit more of a unified voice in the organizations that kind of pop up, because right now it still feels pretty chaotic, and I still feel like when you talk about I forget the term, but vertical like ties to people who are in power, I feel like Altadena's connection to the county is still getting sorted out, and I guess I'm looking for insight about what's a realistic time horizon for the pace of recovery and for these self-organized structures to start to feel a little bit more settled.
Yes, you're asking two great questions, and each of them could be a thesis by itself. So actually, I hope some of our students on this phone call right now looking for projects. The question about pace is a great one. I was involved most recently in Japan's recovery processes, and it took some of them 3 years of meetings to decide on a future. 3 years of living in temporary housing units, 3 years of arguing, 3 years of decision. And the government, in some cases, let them have that time. The government in other places pushed hard and eventually sort of steamrolled them rather than waiting all the way through. So, democracy is messy. People who are really engaged, it can take a while. It can take quite some time to settle on a vision, especially if you do have everyone's involved, which is fantastic news to hear, that everyone's involved, people who are giving their ideas. And of course, in a democracy, people's ideas would differ. right? Are we going to rebuild with new fire zoning requirements? Are we going to rebuild different materials? This happened also in the Marshall fires in Colorado. It was a huge fight. Do we require all new houses now, in a sense, to build back better, i.e., to go have solar panels installed, to go away from gas, to ban two-car drives, like all this kind of stuff, to force more public space to reduce overall lot size, right? So this is a big debate they had. 2,000 houses were lost. It took them quite some time to figure this out. So there's no one size fits all recovery pace. I will say we always talk in terms of years. New Orleans, for example, took roughly 9 to 10 years to reach what I would call equilibrium after that shock. Kobe took about 9.5 to 12 years, depending on what you're measuring, and their economy was never the same. So after major disasters on a wide scale that reach beyond a single community, oftentimes it can be a lot longer thing than we expect, not a year or two, but 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years before the community has, the new construction stops, things are feeling normal again. The other thing we try to measure recovery with is a sense of normalcy. You could be living in a temporary shelter, but if your friends are there, your kids are in school, you have a job, right? The rhythm of life is back to normal again. It may not matter as much that your house isn't ready, right? If you're still with those social connections. So that sense of normalcy is another thing there as well. So this is a really great question. Pace and timing, each disaster has a different one, but I would say it's always slower than, for instance, some cities will say, okay, we're done. We've done this. We're finished. We're walking away. And that's typically within a year or two, which is ridiculous. I've never seen a fully reconstructed city after a major disaster in only a year or two. It's never that quick.
All right, thank you. Megan.
Professor, it seems like so many of the data points that you're talking about are more qualitative, and we live in a world that wants that like quantitative, all the numbers right now. How do we balance living um, within like a county structure that's trying to measure recovery in numbers? And how do we balance that with being humans who need to measure recovery in terms of our efficacy and satisfaction with the process? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, this is a problem. Obviously bureaucrats and bean counters, this is their job, right? Their job is putting beans back in pots and figuring out how many are inside. We try to think about this in different ways. We always argue there's never a single way to capture the recovery process or a disaster. So we call this a holistic perspective. The fancy word is triangulation, meaning it should never be that we're only measuring, let's say, population recovery, not actually having conversations with people or focus groups or individual interviews with people as well. That should never be that way. But at the same time, if we only talk to 5 people and not to 550 or 500, we might be missing a pattern that would emerge, right, if we had enough data to look over those people. So we always begin by arguing there's no single tool, there's no single method that should be used here. We should really be involved. And the other thing we try to argue, and this doesn't go very far, is nothing about us without us. For example, we try to have a community advisory board anytime we have research projects going on. So I don't know if there's social scientists already on the ground there with you or on this phone call with you, but if there are, we make the argument that the data should come from and belong to the community. And the same thing goes from working with county officials or state officials or national officials. No data should be released or provided without first going to the community, showing them what's been collected, asking them for their involvement. Oftentimes we get really good insights from a community advisory board, which says, that's a really dumb question. Ask this question instead, right? And that's the moment we recognize that, again, their insights are much deeper than ours. We're, no expert from the outside will know the community as well as you do. No one from the county, no one from the state, no social scientist. So that's another point where nothing about us without us should be driving what kind of questions are being asked, what's going on in those areas.
Brendan.
Hey Daniel, thanks so much for being here. As a data and general nerd myself, I really appreciate the evidence behind all the research that you're putting forward, and it's something that I relate to. And I'm wondering, in your past working with communities, how you're able to make this same evidence accessible to people who maybe don't have that background.
Yeah, so several things. One is we try to spend time there rather than sort of jumping like I am right now with a hour-long conversation we've never met before. I'm not sure, I mean, I would ideally be there in the community or my colleague working with me we try to have someone. So we did, I don't know if you know a place called Cloverdale, California. Cloverdale had part of the Paradise Fires a few years ago. So to study that community, we literally embedded someone in that community, and they were there for months. And we had got hundreds of interviews and all kind of stuff. Same thing we did in Japan and with Ibasha, we literally embedded someone there. So if they're there already, there's first of all trust and communication. And I mentioned before my lack of knowledge of lingo, the modern day my kids' slang. You begin to have a language in common and stuff in common together. And I think that's one way you do it, rather than me parachuting in for an hour, talking blah blah blah, and then flying out again. Would be actually spending time in the community, working with you, again having the community advisory board guide what we do as scholars, so that the data we collect goes to them first, and then people can say, oh yeah, let's talk about this. What does it mean when you say this was faster than this? What's the comparison? Like, how do we know this is true? So those are the kind of conversations that you have to have if you actually want to be an engaged scholar. It's very easy to publish an article in a journal that 5 people will read, but to actually be involved in recovery that will affect hundreds, if not thousands of people, it takes a lot more effort, I think, to spend that time together.
Thanks for that.
Professor, I want to discuss the so-called dark side of social capital. And there's a line in one of your papers: social capital is generally a resource for those who have substantial access to it and a barrier for those excluded from it. Altadena is a diverse community. So what is the dark side of social capital, and how can people who might have more access to social capital, first of all, avoid harming neighbors who might have less of it, and then also to show up for them?
Yeah, some of the most extreme examples that I've studied came not too long ago. As I mentioned, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the response there actually from the local committees was caste-based, C-A-S-T-E, caste-based. And because people in India, unfortunately, still have a caste system in which you could be, for example, a most backwards caste, a backwards caste, and so forth. So we actually measured thousands of people's outcomes there. Did they get aid? How quickly? How many days were they put in IDP camps and so forth? We could find a pattern there that no individual could have seen, which was that people in castes that were considered to be lower castes were basically being excluded from the rosters of the aid distribution. They were not getting the food, not getting the pots and pans, not getting the money. That's one thing that we've seen. A more extreme case than this was in 1923, a long time ago even for me. But in 1923, there was a massive earthquake in Tokyo. In the fires that broke out afterwards, there actually were riots against Korean residents who were there, business people from Korea, because there are false rumors going out that those migrants had somehow damaged the water system in Tokyo. And that rumor spread, and unfortunately, many people were killed. We don't even know how many were killed, unfortunately. Another example, so being on the outside there, and more generally speaking, I would say what happens, we've seen, is that people on the inside of the committees, we've written a few papers about the committees that are involved in these recovery process, the Build Back Better New Orleans committees after Hurricane Sandy, those tend to be a certain type of person. In the things that we've done, they tend to be, for example, white males and engineers, that's pretty common, or white males and wealthy. And they have a certain vision of what recovery looks like, which not necessarily match what the community wants or the broader region wants. But of course, they're driving policy pretty hard from inside that committee. So that's the dark side. The dark side of social capital means individuals with access to resources, individuals with access to the ears of those in power, to the levers in power, whether it's at the county or the state or the national. Those individuals tend to get more, the squeaky wheel, than individuals on the outside. And typically, this is the other sad thing, individuals on the outside tend to already have a very stressed life. Maybe they have multiple jobs or a big family, or they're really busy with an illness or something else that they can't take every moment they have to go lobby or speak with people or make new friends. So individuals with fewer social ties often end up on the outside of the planning process, the outside of the actual process, and therefore off the list. So that's like the worst case scenario. Individuals who are already vulnerable, maybe someone who's stressed, people who are deeply involved in someone's health, maybe they're a caregiver by a parent's side all the time, they can't go to meetings, they don't have time to fill out a survey or speak to people. Those individuals' voices may not be heard in the process, and they may not necessarily understand to the degree how important it was, right, for someone like that to be on the inside.
Okay, thank you. I have so many follow-up questions, but I'll hold them, and let's go to Charmaine. I see you've had your hand up for a while. Thanks, Charmaine. And then we'll come to you, Val.
Oh, Charmaine, she's muted.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm here now. I'd like to hear some tips on what kind of, I want to call it an inner infrastructure, can be put into place, because everybody in the community at large are at a different level of recovery, so to speak, right? So they're impacted in different ways, although they are sharing the overall reality that the city was burned down. Everybody has that in common. But what's not common is how everyone is processing that. And so to build this more social capital on a personal level, because the corporate level is automatically going to be there because there's money involved. But then what types of infrastructure or inner infrastructure can be put in place so that people are going to be more connected to building social capital no matter what their impact is?
Yeah, this is also a great question. I would start with the idea of mundane, boring things. Like, for example, is there a park? Is there a church? Is there a YMCA? Is there a place people meet regularly, right? To make those connections. Are there established places already in the community where we have regular meetings? I would say ideally not only on Zoom, although Zoom is quite convenient for people who are quite far away, or maybe they're in another state as they get their finances back in order. But what we really want to see to build ties are a number of regular interactions. So not just meeting every month for an hour like we're doing right now, but really having time to build trust through multiple interactions. And again, not necessarily over only on disasters. It could be a book club. It could be a wine club. It could be a travel. It could be I've got kids. Taking my kids to the park kind of thing. The ways that we find building trust works the best is through regular mundane interactions. And if some kind of a team building exercise, a ropes course, those once a year kind of activities, they're great for corporations. But the reality is you build much more trust by seeing someone regularly, remembering their name, remembering something about them and their family. Those are things that we need to think about, right? And it's not that we have to do something fancy to get this to work. Again, we don't need some Harvard MBA, whatever program with new titles and flashing lights or some new tech or some new app. And by the way, everyone's selling those. Everyone's selling apps, everything else. Normal interactions, daily interactions are the kind of processes that we need to build these things. So it's harder if people are scattered. Some people might be in, some people might out, right, as they're waiting for things to happen. But regular meetings, a potluck, a read along, a sing along, those kind of activities, those are things that build ties much more effectively than, let's say, more fancy but irregular activities.
Thank you. That confirms what I've been thinking. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Val.
Yeah, I think there's an element in the Eaton fire disaster that maybe does not exist in others, and that is a major corporation, Edison, has virtually admitted fault. So other places might be dealing with the government, essentially, but like the nuclear plant in Japan was not responsible for the tidal wave. But here we have, although this is not super official, Edison's basically accepted responsibility, and it's offered these compensation programs, which are, some people would say reasonable, but they come with a clause that says you cannot ever sue Edison again if you accept this agreement and settlement, which some people might have to because they are literally out on their streets. There was a press conference just the other day, it was excellent. And many people spoke saying, the rents are ridiculous. I can't afford them. So I was in my car. Then I was in an apartment for 2 months with my family. Now we're back in my car. And I really don't want to accept the Edison money because, we give up our chance of getting a larger settlement later. But what do we do? Because we're virtually homeless. So Edison is a player in this particular disaster, a corporate player that does not necessarily always exist in other situations. And I think that's something that will make this Eaton fire unique and more complex, and may have to, some people may have to settle for the offer that they're making just because they're desperate. The other thing that's unique, maybe not totally, but California rent is really high, and it's gone up after the fire because of the scarcity of rentals. So people, this is mainly affecting, people with a lot of money, they can handle stuff. But there's a large portion of middle, even working class folks in Altadena that are really in trouble. And so that, I think, even though I know all the social bonds between them can be very, very strong, but in many ways, it comes down to money.
Yeah, thank you for those. Actually, it's funny you mentioned both of those I've seen in other disasters. In Japan's actually, it's exactly the same. TEPCO offered a settlement to the families displaced by their fault at the nuclear power plant. They didn't cause the tsunami, but they didn't have proper precautions in place. So it was the exact same kind of offer. Take our offer now, or agree never to sue us again, or good luck with your lawyer there. So actually, they had the exact same pressure, and the rents going up. That's exactly what we see after every disaster. Whether it's in New Orleans back in 2005, whether it's in the Marshall fires in Marshall, California, the Paradise fires in California, those patterns, again, this is why I appreciate being a look across disasters. The involvement of an entity, a corporate entity, or a government one. Same thing happened in the BP oil spill, by the way, as well, with the Vietnamese fishermen offering them one package, but they had to buy in and agree never to settle again with an NDA. So that isn't that uncommon, actually. These cases, what I would call man-made shocks. We do see both the requirement not to sue again and pressure to go quickly. And also at the same time, we do see rents going up and overall housing prices increase, of course, because labor is scarce now and materials are scarce. So I think those are interesting points that you're finding that have happened elsewhere.
Thanks. Jane, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, can you talk a little bit about, because I mean, I would imagine other disasters come with health implications. And this one certainly will, and already is beginning to. But I think we're going to see more of it this year and subsequently in the years following. Can you talk a little bit about some of these after effects of health implications on a community and how communities survive isn't even the right word, right? Because people will die off. How do they continue? How do they work together? What does it look like?
Yeah, these are really great questions, and some of them we're not going to be able to answer, unfortunately, until 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. For example, in Japan's case, the radiation consequences of exposure, many of those are not immediate. So the consequences, for example, for people exposed may be cancer in 5 to 10 years. It may be their children getting cancer in 10 to 15 years. So the health effects from these disasters, whether it's ppm or smoke particulate in the case of fires, whether it's radiation in Japan's cases, we don't know. Part of this, though, I think, is what we can talk about now, which is the mental health aspect. That is an area we know for a fact impacts physical health. People who are facing anxiety, people facing depression, we can measure. We actually do this different study that we've done on several different cases, has been about the number of days of work missed, for example, overall feelings of health, again, asking people about how they feel about their lives and their health. Most disasters do come with what we call secondary effects. And those secondary effects are things like the stress of not knowing what to do, the daily pressures of having an old mortgage you're still paying because it's double jeopardy, having to get a new place to live, or the stresses of losing privacy or losing the sense of life that we had before, the sense of rhythms. Those are all measurable mental stresses on survivors, and those are things we should be talking about. We strongly encourage communities to make psychosocial care front and center as they're still negotiating on housing or working on plans for the future or whatever else. The reality is every day we're in an environment that's been destroyed, whether we had our house destroyed or partially damaged, whether we lost our job or just a slight inconvenience now, all of us have different levels of mental health challenges. So I think really this is a really critical element to just be thinking about what are we doing right now to ensure everyone in this community has access to mental health care, has access to therapy, has access to people. The other thing that we've actually just published an article about 2 weeks ago was elevating mental health elevating social connections in health to the same level as doctors they ask me whenever I go, Daniel, are you smoking? Daniel, are you drinking? Or are you using drugs, right? Those are questions I think probably many of us get from our medical providers. So we are pushing now that medical field should be asking, do you feel isolated? Do you feel alone? To what degree do you feel you have an active network? So because we've seen the health consequences of mental health. So I can't answer the question about the long-term impact of the fire. I don't know. In the same way, I don't know what's going to happen in Fukushima, but I do know right now, in the short and medium term, a bigger risk, I think, for me would be psychosocial first aid. How are we taking care of each other and our mental health?
I appreciate you saying that. Did you study 9/11 at all?
One of my colleagues and I did, yes.
So there was certainly a lot of health implications that fell out with that.
Yes.
Did you follow how the community supported those who were getting sick and
Yeah, so
what
a
that
lot of the
sort of
work,
looked like?
yeah, a lot of the work that we did actually was on providing counseling and therapy up front, not only to the survivors in the communities nearby, people who watched the towers come down, people who were working that day, but also to the first responders, actually, which is a group we haven't talked about much in this phone call, but they had both mental and physical health challenges. And eventually the government, as you know, did recognize that working at ground zero was the cause of a number of traceable illnesses, and finally did provide federal assistance for many of the firefighters who died in many cases within about 4.5, 5 years of 9/11. So there are studies that's a little bit further in the past. There are more recent studies as well of both the mental and physical health consequences of these kind of shocks.
Okay, thanks, Professor, and thank you, Jane. I've got two more short questions for you, and then we'll close with a question from Ellen in the chat. Okay, I got like one bad question and one hopefully nicer question. In thinking about systemic racism and that dimension in disaster recovery, I'm wondering also in this current moment in our national politics, if there's anything in your research that points to how we can show up for neighbors who are recovering and also might be targets of the state.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this bottom-up driven culture of resilience emerging in a lot of places. Where I live in Boston, so we're seeing this in Boston, in Houston, in California, in Chicago. People have WhatsApp groups. We actually have a call-in line called "If you see ICE, call them lice." We actually have a cell phone that you can call and report where they are, so people keep track of them geographically. I think these are all good examples of communities taking care of their own. When you are concerned for people, when you care about people, then any threat, whether it's a governmental threat in this case or a natural hazard or something else, are things that you can build and rally around people who you know are vulnerable. So I think, again, doing what people are doing, helping people shelter. I know that some churches, for example, near where we live, literally like an underground railroad, were sheltering migrants who believed that they were at risk of being deported. And also bystanders, right? Saying things, getting involved, taking pictures, doing what they can, right? Documenting what's going on, if nothing else. Not being a passive bystander in these moments. These are our communities. Because we're invested in them, we've chosen voice and not exit. When we see someone in trouble, we should do what we can to help.
Thank you. One more question, just quickly. I wanted to circle back to Ibasho cafes and was wondering if you could speak specifically to the role that elders played in setting up and operating Ibasho cafes.
Yeah, so a lot of the literature that we found argued that the elderly were the most vulnerable population. But actually, if you studied it closely, it's the interaction of being elderly and isolated. Elderly people, especially in Japan, but probably around the world, have been through a lot more crap than people who are younger than they are. So in Japan, the elderly had already been through World War II in some cases. They'd been through no electricity in some cases. They knew how to handle a period, which was a month, with no running water and no electricity. They'd been through that before, and they knew exactly where to go in the woods to get running water that was clean. They knew how to set up a fire. So those skills came to them more easily than 13-year-olds who spent their days playing on Pokemon. Right. So a lot of the process that we tried to do was pushing the argument that the vulnerable people is anyone who's isolated. It doesn't really matter their age. And Ibashu tries to flip the script and say the elderly have wisdom and perspectives that can help those of us who are much younger than the 65 plus ages people there. And we should be listening to them rather than treating them as if there's some kind of gingerly easable breakable thing.
I love that. Thank you. Okay. And we will close with this question from Ellen Ripberger in the chat. What can community organizations or individuals do to improve recovery? What have you seen in your research that works?
Yeah, so I mean, I would go back to that slide deck I showed earlier, starting with Mr. Rogers, collecting on a neighborhood level, a geographic level, making sure the neighborhood is involved. Even if you have a WhatsApp group already, are we knocking on doors? Do we know who needs food? Do we know who needs shelter? Do we know who hasn't been coming to meetings? right? That's how I start thinking about this, right, in the negative. Who hasn't been showing up? Whose voices haven't we been hearing? To what degree are the plans and the visions for the future taking social infrastructure seriously? Parks, libraries, outdoor dog walking areas, places of worship, YMCA's, gyms. To what degree is space being set aside for that or enlarged, right? Those are critical elements for our society. Meeting attendance. Are we making sure that as many people as can afford it are having meetings? Should the meeting be held more than once? In Boston, we actually have the same meeting several times. And after school hours, during school hours, on a Sunday night and a Monday morning, we try to make sure that the same meeting is held so everyone we can possibly involved gets involved in that process. Are we involving local groups? Again, faith-based groups, civil society organizations, the Shriners, the whatever 4-H, whatever groups you have there. I've got no idea, obviously. Whatever groups you have there, are they being invited? Are they coming? We found again, the more allies we have in the process, the more voices that we hear. And finally, ways of getting people to volunteer. Everyone feels busy. Everyone feels stressed. We have the recovery process going on. One of my colleagues calls this compressed time, right? Everything feels like it's happening at once. But the more of us that can put down our phones, get out of our homes and get outside and help people, whether it's taking care of the unhoused, whether it's cleaning up a river nearby, whether it's volunteering at school, those activities build resilient communities. So everything that we can do, all of those things I just mentioned, we have found measurably deepen bonding and bridging ties and increase trust as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Aldrich. We really, really appreciate you being here. And thank you to everybody who joined. We're going to keep this room open. If folks want to stick around and have a conversation, be happy to do that. Thank you so much, Professor Aldrich.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night.